A pregnant lion pounded on his door at midnight, begging for help. A stormy night. A desperate knock. When Ranger Ethan Carter opened his cabin door, he froze. Because standing there was a pregnant lioness, bleeding and begging for help. What happened next would shatter every rule of the wild, bind their lives forever, and end in a twist no one could have imagined. Rain hammered against the tin roof of the Red Canyon Ranger cabin, a steady drumbeat that usually lulled Ethan Carter into the kind of deep sleep only men who lived alone in the wilderness knew. But tonight, something pulled him from that sleep with the force of a hand gripping his shoulder. His eyes snapped open into darkness, just as a sound rolled through the small cabin. 3 heavy knocks against the wooden door. Not the wind, not an animal brushing past. Deliberate, measured, like someone or something was asking permission to enter. Ethan held still, listening. The rain muffled everything except the echo of those knocks still vibrating in his chest. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, every instinct in him tightening. Visitors didn't come here this late, not during a storm that had turned the canyon trails into rivers of mud. He reached for the flashlight on the nightstand and clicked it on, the narrow beam cutting through the shadows. Another knock, slower this time, almost weak. He moved to the window beside the door, careful to stay to the side. Years of ranger work, and years before that in military service, had trained his body to move in silence. He lifted the edge of the curtain just enough to see outside, and the moment his eyes focused, the breath left him. There, standing in the wash of rain and lightning, was a lioness. Her body was soaked, her golden coat darkened and clumped by the storm. She stood with her head lowered, her chest rising in uneven, shallow breaths, and her belly, round, impossibly heavy, told him she was close to giving birth, much too close to be wandering alone in a storm. Ethan leaned closer, disbelieving what the light revealed. A cut ran down her foreleg, angry and swollen, the kind only a steel trap could make. Blood mixed with rainwater and dripped onto the wooden porch in thin pink streams. She was trembling, barely upright, barely holding on. But what stunned him most wasn't the wound, or the way she swayed with exhaustion. It was her eyes. Through the sheet of rain, she lifted her gaze to the window, not with the cold focus of a predator sizing up prey, but with something he never imagined he'd see in the eyes of a lion, pleading, soft, raw, stripped of all wild dominance, a mother's desperation carved into every slow blink. For a long moment, they stared at each other through the glass and the storm. Ethan's heartbeat thinned into a hard, steady rhythm. This wasn't possible. Lions didn't approach humans willingly, not injured, not pregnant, not ever. The wilderness had laws, and this broke all of them. Lightning flared again, and in that quick burst of white, he saw her legs buckle. She caught herself, barely, lifting her head again with a trembling effort. Then came a sound, so faint he almost missed it over the storm. A soft, low rumble. Not a growl, not a warning. A call for help. A call meant for him. He stepped back from the window, breath shaking. Every survival instinct he had screamed the same thing. Stay inside, stay away, lock the door. But something deeper, older than instinct, older than fear, pressed against his ribs. That lion was dying, and if she died, the lives inside her would go with her. The rain outside shifted direction, slamming harder against the walls. A gust rattled the windows, and then 3 more knocks, weak, uneven, but unmistakable. She was knocking again. Ethan swallowed hard, his hand hovering over the lock. He had seen many strange things living out here in Red Canyon, but nothing like this. Nothing that reached past logic and grabbed him by the heart, the way this moment did. He imagined her collapsing out there in the mud, alone and in pain, her cubs never seeing the world. And then he imagined doing nothing. His chest tightened. He reached for the lock. The metal clicked loudly in the small cabin, the sound swallowed instantly by the storm. He pulled the door open just a few inches, rain blowing in through the gap. The lioness stood inches away, her eyes catching the lamplight behind him. Up close, he could see every tremor that shook her body, every wound etched into her skin. She didn't move forward. She simply stood there, waiting for him to decide. Ethan opened the door wider. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then, with a slow and staggering step, the lioness crossed the threshold. Her paw slid on the wood, her massive frame trembling as she forced herself inside. A soft thud landed behind him as she collapsed onto the cabin floor, her body folding in on itself like a storm-beaten tree finally giving way. Ethan shut the door against the wind, the cabin falling into a strange, heavy silence. He turned back to the lioness lying half-conscious on the floorboards. Her breaths came shallow and uneven. Her eyes fluttered open just enough to meet his one more time. Not wild, not threatening, just pleading. And in that moment, he understood. Whatever this night would become, it had already changed everything. The lioness lay motionless on the wooden floor, her sides rising and falling in uneven, shallow waves. Rain still clung to her coat, collecting in the grooves of her ribs, darkening the tawny fur that in the daylight might have glowed like sunlit grass. Now it looked muted, heavy, as if the storm had taken more from her than warmth. Ethan knelt slowly, careful not to make a single sound that might startle her. Though the truth was, she looked far beyond reacting. Exhaustion had hollowed her movements. Pain had carved the edges of her breath. He held the flashlight low, angling it so the beam didn't blind her. The light revealed the full extent of her condition, and his stomach tightened. She was, unquestionably, on the very edge of collapse. Her belly hung low and swollen, the unmistakable curve of late pregnancy. But this wasn't simply a mother close to giving birth. This was a mother who had run out of time. Her foreleg told the rest of the story. A loop of wire, thin, rusted, and cruelly twisted, cut deep into the muscle above her paw. A snare, illegal, vicious, and devastatingly efficient. It had cinched tighter with each step she tried to take, slicing deeper until her leg trembled from shock. Blood had dried in a dark crust around the wound, but fresh droplets glistened beneath it, mixing with rainwater on the cabin floor. Every tremor in her body sent a ripple through the injured limb. Ethan swallowed hard. He had seen injuries like this before. Deer caught in poachers' traps, coyotes staggering through the brush, but never a lioness. Never a mother ready to give birth, and never one who chose to come to him. Through a storm, through fear, through instinct, through the sharp ache of her own body failing her. He lowered the flashlight and spoke softly, his voice barely above the murmuring storm outside. Easy. Just breathe. I'm right here. He didn't know if the words mattered to her, but they mattered to him. His own pulse felt too loud in his ears, too fast. As though his body was trying to warn him, he was standing in the kind of moment that fractured the world in two, the time before and the time after. He reached out his hand slowly, palm open and empty, letting her see it as plainly as she could in the dim cabin. Her gaze followed the motion, but she didn't lift her head. Her golden eyes, glazed with exhaustion, flickered as if she were fighting to keep them open, not to threaten, not to size him up, but to judge whether he was a danger or a lifeline. You came here for a reason, he whispered, his throat tightening. You wouldn't be here if you didn't need help. Outside, thunder rolled across the canyon, deep and distant, shaking a thin dusting of wood from the rafters. The storm had no intention of letting up. The wind pressed hard against the sides of the cabin, rattling the window panes like restless fingers. He imagined her out there in the cold, rain soaking her wound, her contractions beginning in the middle of a storm. she wouldn't have survived the night. Not alone. He set the flashlight on the floor and reached for his medical kit, an old olive-drab box he'd carried since his military days. He hesitated before opening it, glancing once more at the lioness. Her breathing was slow and ragged, but her eyes remained fixed on him. A mother's eyes. Not feral, not wild. Worn, afraid, but determined. He opened the kit, the metal lid clicking softly. Scissors, gauze, antiseptic, bandages, tweezers. Nothing meant for treating a lioness, much less one in her condition. But it would have to be enough. The snare was the first problem. He slid closer, inch by inch, never breaking eye contact. "I'm going to help you with that leg," he murmured, letting the softness of his voice act as a warning and a reassurance at once. "I promise I won't hurt you." He wasn't sure if she could understand tone or intent, but he spoke anyway. Words weren't for her. They were for the shaking in his own hands. Her body tensed when he came within arm's reach. One paw twitched as though some ancient instinct stirred beneath the pain. But she didn't lift her head. She didn't snarl. She only watched him, chest quivering, breath shallow and uneven. He brought the scissors toward the wire and paused. The snare had embedded so deeply that cutting it free wouldn't be clean. He'd have to lift the loop to slide the blade beneath. That meant touching the wound directly. He steadied his breath, then slipped his fingers gently beneath the tightest part of the wire. The lioness didn't lash out. Instead, a shudder ran through her body, a quiver of pain she'd been holding back for too long. I know, he said, his voice breaking as he lifted the loop enough to angle the scissors. Rain hammered the roof harder, as if the storm were bearing witness. In one swift, firm motion, he cut the wire. The snare snapped open, springing apart, releasing its brutal grip. The flesh beneath parted slightly, swollen and raw, but freed at last. The lioness gasped, a sharp, low sound more hurt than threat, and her paw flexed involuntarily. "It's over," Ethan whispered. "You're free now." Her eyes fluttered. A slow blink, pain and relief mixing in equal measure. He cleaned the wound with warm water from the kettle on the stove, lifting her leg as gently as he could. Each touch earned a faint tremor, but never a growl, never a warning. She lay still, letting him help her, trusting him in a way that seemed to defy the laws of the world he knew. He wrapped her leg loosely with clean gauze, leaving room for swelling, and placed a folded blanket beneath her to keep the cold floor from draining what little strength she had left. When he finished, he sat back on his heels, chest tight. Her breaths were steadier now, deeper, though still heavy with exhaustion. She blinked at him again, slower this time, softer, as if acknowledging him. "You're fighting for them," he murmured, eyes drifting to her swollen belly. "You made it all the way here because you knew you had to." A gust of wind struck the cabin so hard the lights flickered. Beyond the canyon walls, a low roar echoed, distant but unmistakable. A male lion. Ethan stiffened. If a male was nearby, the situation had just become infinitely more dangerous. Wild males were unpredictable around birthing females. Instinct drove them into territorial frenzies, and he was standing between one and the mother he wanted. The lioness lifted her head slightly, sensing it too. Her ears twitched, her body tensing despite her exhaustion. She looked toward the door as another distant roar swept across the canyon. "You're safe here," Ethan whispered. "I won't let anything get in." The storm raged, the wind howled, and the thunder rolled like the sky itself was splitting open. But inside the cabin, a fragile, sacred stillness settled between the wounded mother and the man who refused to abandon her. She lowered her head to the blanket, easing into a trembling, exhausted rest. Ethan stayed beside her, watching the slow rise and fall of her breath, watching the storm's reflection dance across her golden coat. Outside, danger prowled in the darkness. But here, for this moment, she was safe. A mother on the edge of life, and he was the only thing standing between her and the storm outside, and the storm still coming. Ethan rose slowly from where he'd been kneeling, wiping the blood and rainwater from his hands on a towel as quietly as he could. The cabin felt impossibly small now, its wooden walls too thin to protect anything so fragile from the wild pressing against them. The lioness lay breathing in ragged motions, her body limp with exhaustion, her leg wrapped in bandages that already showed faint traces of seepage. For a moment, Ethan just stood there, one hand braced on the back of a chair, trying to steady the tremor running through him. He had broken protocol. He had broken instinct. He had broken the invisible line separating man from predator. And yet, looking at her, helpless, shivering, fighting for breath, it was the only decision he could have lived with. But something else was coming. The storm outside deepened, thunder rolling so heavily that the floorboards beneath his boots seemed to hum. The wind slammed against the windows in violent sheets, the cabin rattling with every gust. Ethan walked to the door and pressed his ear to it, listening past the roar of the storm. It was faint at first, a low vibration carried on the wind, so distant he thought he imagined it. But then it came again. Deeper, harder, closer. A lion's roar, not hers. A male's. Ethan's body stiffened, heat rising in his chest. He'd worked the Red Canyon territory long enough to know what that sound meant. A dominant male patrolling his range. A male who would respond violently if he smelled a birthing female, or cubs. Instinct drove lions to protect territory with ruthless efficiency, especially when another male's scent mixed in the air. And now the scent of childbirth was close. Too close. He turned back to the lioness. She lifted her head slightly, her ears twitching at the distant call. A low rumble formed at the back of her throat. Fear, not aggression. She knew. She understood the danger even through her haze of pain. "Easy," Ethan whispered, stepping closer. "You're safe here. Nothing's getting in that door." He wasn't sure who he was trying to convince. The next roar came sharper, slicing through the storm like a blade. Closer, much closer. Ethan grabbed the flashlight again and dimmed the lamp on the wall. The last thing he needed was the cabin glowing like a beacon in the dark. He moved slowly, quietly, checking the windows one by one, securing locks, fastening shutters. The lioness watched his movements, her breathing quicker now, chest rising with anxious rhythm. He approached her again, crouching on the floor. "I need you to stay calm," he whispered, though he knew she couldn't obey commands any more than she could speak them. Still, she blinked once, slow, deliberate, as if acknowledging his voice. Another roar hit the cabin walls. This one was unmistakably close. Ethan stood sharply, every muscle in his body tensing. He crossed to the emergency shelf and grabbed the heavy beam spotlight and a long wooden handle he kept near the door. Not a weapon, not enough to fend off a lion, but something to create noise or distraction if he had no choice. His heart pounded so hard he felt it in his teeth. The male was outside. He heard the heavy thump of paws landing on the wet earth. A shadow moved past the front window, large, massive, unmistakable. Ethan held his breath. The lion's silhouette stopped directly in front of the door. The wood creaked under the pressure of its weight as the male pressed its nose against the seam, sniffing deeply, inhaling the scent of the female inside. The lioness inside tensed, her body curling instinctively around her swollen belly. A soft, terrified whine escaped her. Ethan stepped between her and the door. He didn't raise the stick. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, breathing slow, steady, making himself a barrier between the wounded mother and the predator outside. He knew what could happen. He knew a single strike from that massive paw could shatter the door. He knew the male could burst in, driven by instincts older than memory. He knew he had no way to stop him, but he stayed anyway. The male sniffed again, harder this time, and a deep guttural rumble crawled through the walls. Ethan braced himself, forcing every fear down into the pit of his stomach. He whispered, barely moving his lips, "Not tonight. Not this family." A sudden crack of thunder ripped across the canyon, so loud it rattled the window frames. The male flinched at the noise, stepping back from the door. A flash of lightning illuminated the porch for the briefest moment, revealing his broad shoulders and dark mane soaked by the storm. Then he turned away, pacing along the edge of the cabin, circling, searching. Ethan stayed where he was, not daring to move. Minutes crawled by. The storm howled. The rafters creaked. The male's form passed by the windows once, twice, 3 times. Each time his massive shadow dragged across the walls. Ethan felt the lioness curl tighter behind him, her breath sharp with fear. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, the male's roars grew softer, pulled away by distance. His heavy footsteps thudded against the muddy ground as he moved back into the canyon. Ethan exhaled long and shaky, the tension draining from his legs so fast he had to grab the back of a chair to keep himself upright. His shirt clung to his spine, soaked with a cold sweat he hadn't noticed forming. He turned to the lioness. Her breathing had steadied, though her eyes remained fixed on the door long after the danger had passed. She blinked at him again, slow, heavy, deliberate, a gesture that felt like more than instinct, a fragile piece of trust exchanged in silence. "It's all right," he whispered. "He's gone." The storm began to ease, the thunder rolling farther away into the dark. Rain softened to a steady patter. Ethan slid down the wall until he sat on the floor beside her, exhausted. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but tonight had rewritten something inside him. He had broken every rule he'd lived by, and somehow it felt like the only thing that made sense. Outside, the male lion's distant roar bounced off the canyon walls one last time, a warning to anyone listening that the night was not over. But inside the cabin, for the moment, peace settled in. A fragile, trembling peace between a man and a wild mother fighting for her life. And the storm waiting beyond the hill was only the beginning. Ethan stayed beside her long after the last rumble of thunder faded into the far reaches of Red Canyon. The cabin felt strangely still now, as if the storm outside had sucked all the movement out of the world and left only this moment suspended in its place. The lioness lay curled on the blanket he'd placed under her, her bandaged legs stretched awkwardly in front of her. She was breathing, steady enough to keep hope alive, but every rise and fall of her chest looked like a battle she was barely winning. He watched her for a long time, the lamplight flickering over her damp coat. In that warm, trembling glow, she didn't look like a creature that ruled the plains. She didn't look dangerous. She looked tired, bone-deep tired. The kind of tired that came from running too long, carrying too much, fighting for too many lives at once. The kind of exhaustion Ethan had seen before, mostly in soldiers who had pushed themselves past human limits to protect the people they loved. "You've been carrying this alone," he whispered. "Too long." His voice broke the silence gently, like a hand brushing against still water. The lioness didn't lift her head, but one ear flicked, acknowledging him. That small movement told him everything. She was listening. She was aware of him. She wasn't drifting away. Not yet. Ethan reached for the kettle again, pouring warm water into a bowl. He'd have preferred proper veterinary supplies, antibiotics, fluids, sedation, but those were many miles away. The nearest wildlife center was down in Cedar Grove, a dangerous drive on a clear day and an impossible one in a storm. Tonight, it was just him, the lioness, and the cabin walls that felt too thin for the weight of what they protected. He dampened a cloth and moved toward her slowly, always keeping his movements firm. Steady, visible. She tracked him with her eyes. Golden, steady, filled with a tired intelligence. As he crouched beside her, she tensed, not in hostility or in fear. He could see it in the way her breath hitched, in the subtle shift of her muscles, in the soft, uncertain flick of her tail. "It's okay," he murmured, lowering himself to the floor so he wasn't towering over her. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to make this easier." He extended the cloth, giving her time to smell it. The warm steam drifted upward, carrying the scent of clean water, earth, and the faint medicinal tone of the ointment he'd used earlier. Her nostrils flared. She didn't recoil. In fact, she closed her eyes for a moment, as if the warmth itself offered some comfort. Taking that as permission, he dabbed gently at the dried mud and blood around her paws and chest. She winced, but she didn't snap, didn't pull away. Her trust wasn't whole, wasn't certain, but it was forming, and that alone made his throat burn with something deeper than fear. When he reached her injured leg again, he lifted the edge of the bandage to check the wound. The skin beneath was swollen, tender, bearing the angry red imprint of the snare that had cut into her. He worked as carefully as he could, soaking the cloth with warm water and rinsing away dirt. Each touch brought a tremor, but she stayed where she was, eyes half open, watching him with a fragile surrender. "You're doing good," he said softly, unsure why he felt the need to speak to her the way one might speak to a frightened child. "You're stronger than anyone should be." The lioness let out a slow exhale, a deep, tired sound, and laid her head fully on the blanket. For the first time since stepping into the cabin, she looked like she might sleep. But something in Ethan pulled him back before he let her drift off. Something he couldn't ignore. Her breathing. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was labor. He noticed it now. The slight tightening of her abdomen, the deep waves of breath that came not from fatigue, but from her body preparing for something urgent. She wasn't just fighting the snare injury. She wasn't just trying to stay alive. She was preparing to give birth. The realization struck him with a jolt that coursed through every nerve in his body. He had known she was close, of course. Her belly made that unmistakable. But he hadn't been ready for it to happen now, in the middle of a storm, in the middle of the night, in a cabin with no medical equipment, no help, no way out. He looked at her face, tense, eyes squeezed shut, and felt the truth settle like a weight against his chest. She had come here because she knew she couldn't do it alone. Ethan wasn't sure if that was instinct, luck, or something more unexplainable, but he knew it mattered. He sat beside her, pulling the blanket closer to her body. Outside, the wind continued to lash against the cabin, but inside, the air thickened with something sacred, something fragile. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then she tensed again, harder. A low, pained groan rumbled through her chest. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice trembling despite his efforts to keep it steady. "I'm right here. You're safe. I won't leave you." The lioness opened her eyes, barely, and looked at him. Not at his hands, not at the floor. At him. A recognition passed between them. Wordless. Ancient. Impossible. As another contraction seized her body, she didn't pull away from him. She didn't try to find a corner or hide. She stayed where she was, beside him, letting the storm outside scream for her while she fought for the lives inside her. Ethan reached out, placing his hand gently on the blanket near her paw, not touching her, not daring, but close enough for her to feel his presence. "You're not alone anymore," he whispered. The lioness blinked once, slowly, her breath quivering through the pain. In that fragile exchange, between a wounded mother and a man who had long believed he'd seen everything, an unspoken vow formed. A pact sealed not with words, but with the silent agreement that neither of them would face what was coming alone. And as the next contraction tightened her body, shaking her from ribs to tail, Ethan knew this night was about to descend into something far deeper than danger, far deeper than fear. This was the beginning of something sacred, and he was the only witness. For a moment, everything inside the cabin fell completely still. The storm outside clawed at the walls, the wind howling like a living thing desperate to break inside. But here, around the lioness, there was a strange, fragile quiet. Ethan stayed crouched beside her, his breath locked in his chest, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the thin barrier of calm, keeping her grounded. Her sides tightened again, her muscles rippling under her damp fur, and she let out a deep, low moan that vibrated through the wooden floor and into his bones. He looked toward the door without meaning to. Instinct, habit, survival training. But the fear that flared inside him had little to do with the lioness. It came from the memory of the roaring outside, the huge shadow pacing along the cabin walls, searching for the scent of a female in labor. The male lion had not gone far, that much he knew, and if he returned, if he caught even the faintest whiff of weakness or vulnerability, the situation could become catastrophic. The storm struck again, lashing the windows with sheets of rain so heavy they sounded like fists pounding on the glass. Ethan tightened his jaw. No help was coming tonight. No radio call could get through this weather. No rescue teams would brave the canyon roads until morning. If anything went wrong, he was completely alone. The lioness shifted, pulling his attention back to her. Her breathing was short, sharp, her body working through another wave of pain. She tried to brace herself, but her injured leg buckled, and she collapsed harder onto the blanket. A startled sound escaped her, small and desperate, like a mother trying not to cry out in front of her cubs. Ethan felt something twist painfully inside him. "It's all right," he murmured, though his voice trembled. "I've got you. You're going to get through this." She looked up at him, not fully, just enough that their eyes met. And for one impossibly human moment, the fear in her gaze softened. There was something else behind it now, something that told him she understood he wasn't there to hurt her. She blinked slowly, like a silent nod, then lowered her head back down. Ethan rose to grab a fresh towel, his mind racing. The air inside the cabin felt warm and thick, humidity mixing with the scent of rain and the earthy musk of the lioness. He knelt again, wiping the moisture from her fur and trying to offer whatever comfort he could. She accepted his presence more readily this time, barely flinching when he touched the blanket near her shoulder. But the storm had other plans. A flash of lightning tore across the sky, turning the cabin windows into blinding white panes. A split second later, thunder exploded, so violent it rattled every cup, plate, and loose nail in the cabin. The lioness jerked, instinctively trying to rise, and the sudden movement caused her entire body to seize in pain. She made a sound then, raw, pained, terrified, and Ethan reacted without thinking, placing a steadying hand near her side, whispering calming words he wasn't sure she could hear. "It's okay. Easy. Easy now. You're safe." She didn't strike. She didn't recoil. Her muscles relaxed slowly beneath the tension, though her breathing stayed quick and shallow. Ethan glanced toward the windows again. The storm wasn't letting up. The thunder rolled endlessly between the canyon walls, echoing like distant drums. Each time the lioness's ears twitched, and her tail flicked against the floor, signs he recognized as stress building beneath her control. And the longer the storm raged, the more likely it was that the male lion would return, drawn by sound, scent, or instinct. Another contraction hit her, harder this time. Her body arched, her claws extending against the blanket, gripping it for leverage. Ethan leaned forward, unable to stop himself, whispering steady encouragements. Her breaths came in staggered bursts, each one labored, each one more desperate than the last. "You're doing it," he whispered, listening to the storm beat against the cabin walls. "Keep going. You're almost there." But deep down, he wasn't sure. The injury, the exhaustion, the storm, too many things were working against her. He felt helpless, more helpless than he had in years. Back in his military days, at least he had backup. Medics, teams, radios, even the smallest chance of reinforcement. Here there was nothing, only him, a flickering lamp, and a lioness fighting pain he could barely comprehend. She groaned again, louder this time, lifting her head to bite softly into the blanket to steady herself. Her whole body trembled. Ethan clenched his hands into fists, wishing he had anything to make the process easier. Warm water could only do so much. Gentle words were a weak shield against the primal force coursing through her. A sudden thump outside made him freeze. Not thunder. Footsteps. Heavy. Deliberate. Too familiar. The male lion had returned. Ethan felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. He moved quietly toward the window, peering through the narrow seam in the curtain. Lightning illuminated the world for a split second. And there he was. Massive. Soaked, mane heavy with rain. His head turned toward the cabin, ears angled forward, nostrils flaring, searching, listening, claiming. Ethan stepped back from the window, breath caught in his throat. He looked back at the lioness. She was shaking, her ears pressed flat, a low rumble building in her chest. Not a warning, but fear. A fear only a mother understands. The storm cracked again, pulling the male lion's attention for a moment. He prowled along the porch, sniffing at the ground, scratching at the wooden post, asserting presence, dominance, territory. "Not tonight," Ethan whispered under his breath, his voice tight with determination. "You're not getting in here. Not while she's like this." He reached for the lantern, dimming the light further, then moved toward the lioness again. She had curled protectively around her belly, breathing in short, sharp bursts. "You're okay," he told her, kneeling. "Stay with me, just focus on breathing." But the storm had one more blow left. The cabin shook as a gust slammed into it, rattling the windows. The male outside gave a deep roar, so close it vibrated through the floor and into Ethan's bones. The lioness jerked, her body tightening into another violent contraction, her breath tearing from her in a harsh cry. Ethan moved beside her again, lowering himself until he was close enough for her to see him clearly. He held his hand near her paw, not touching, but offering. "You're not alone," he said softly. "I'm here. I'm right here." The lioness looked at him through pain-clouded eyes, and in that fleeting moment, something passed between them. Trust, fragile and trembling, but real. An understanding that defied reason, defied instinct, defied everything he'd ever been taught about what wild animals were capable of. Her body spasmed again, stronger than before. She let out a sound that cut through the storm like a knife. Raw, primal, gut-wrenching. And Ethan knew. This was the beginning of the birth. Outside, the male roared again, pacing in the darkness like a shadow of the storm. But inside, the real storm, the sacred one, was unfolding. And Ethan braced himself, heart pounding, as the lioness gathered the last strength she had left. Life was coming, and it was coming now. The lioness strained again, her muscles seizing with a force that seemed to rise from someplace older than instinct, something buried deep in the marrow of all living creatures. Her claws dug into the blanket as another wave of pain ripped through her, her breath coming in short, desperate bursts. Ethan knelt beside her, his hands hovering helplessly in the air, close enough for her to feel his presence, but not so close that he risked startling her. The cabin, once filled with the restless fury of the storm, now felt like a sacred chamber. Every sound, the storm, the wind, even the thunder, seemed muffled compared to the raw, powerful struggle happening on the wooden floor. She let out a low groan, deeper and more primal than anything Ethan had ever heard. It wasn't a threat, wasn't fear. It was the sound of a mother fighting for life. Her eyes squeezed shut, her sides trembling as another contraction seized her body. Ethan leaned forward instinctively, whispering words he'd spoken to injured soldiers long before this night. "You're doing good. Just breathe. You're stronger than you think." She didn't understand the words, but she understood his tone. Her breathing steadied slightly, her focus tightening as her body prepared for the next push. Ethan noticed a change, a shift in her positioning, a tension gathering around her hips and tail. She was bracing herself, preparing for the moment that would decide everything. Outside, the male lion roared again, the sound echoing across the canyon like a rolling drum. Lightning split the sky, thunder chased it, but inside the cabin, another storm was reaching its peak. Her body convulsed, her tail flicking hard against the floor. Ethan's heart hammered as he leaned closer, unable to tear his eyes away. Then, beneath her trembling form, he saw it. A small movement, a glistening shimmer in the dim lantern light. Something was emerging. "It's happening," he whispered. "You're doing it." The lioness let out a long, guttural sound, half cry, half roar, soaked in pain and strength. Her body tightened again, every muscle straining. And then, in one final push, a tiny, slick shape slipped free onto the blanket, glistening with fluid and trembling faintly. A cub. It lay still for a second. Too still. Ethan's stomach clenched. The lioness, exhausted and panting, didn't move right away. For a terrifying moment, the cabin fell into a silence so deep, Ethan could hear nothing but the pounding of his own heartbeat. Then the cub took its first breath. A sharp, tiny gasp, a fragile sound, but a sound of life. The lioness lifted her head slowly, as if fighting through a fog of agony, and turned toward her newborn. Her tongue reached out, trembling at first, then moving with growing urgency. She licked the cub firmly, over and over, clearing its airway, cleaning its fur, coaxing it into the world with every rough stroke. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He watched, awestruck, as the cub twitched, then let out a soft, weak mewl. The lioness nuzzled it closer to her belly, curling her body around it despite the pain still rippling through her. "You did it," Ethan whispered. "You did it." But the night wasn't done with her yet. As soon as the lioness began to settle, her body tensed again. Another contraction. It hit her harder this time, her entire frame shaking with the effort. She let out a strained groan and lifted her head toward Ethan, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. He moved closer, but stayed just out of reach, whispering softly, trying to anchor her through the fear. "It's okay. You're not alone. I'm here." Another push. Another wave of pain rippled through her. Ethan saw movement again, another tiny shape crowning. The lioness panted, her breath shallow and ragged, then gathered the last of her strength and pushed again. A second cub slid free onto the blanket. This one moved almost immediately, its small limbs trembling, its soft cry weak but persistent. The lioness lowered her head, her breath hitching, and repeated the ritual, licking, cleaning, urging life into the fragile body. She pulled it close to the first, curling herself protectively around both newborns. Thunder rolled again, but this time, Ethan barely heard it. His world had narrowed to the scene before him, a mother gathering her strength around her children, vulnerable yet fierce, exhausted yet unbroken. The contrast was almost too much for him. A lump rose in his throat, and he blinked hard against the sting in his eyes. The lioness nuzzled her cubs closer, their small bodies pressed into her belly, seeking warmth, instinctively knowing where life was. She let out a soft, low rumble, gentle, rhythmic, nothing like the growls he'd feared earlier. It was a mother's voice, a lullaby meant for ears only inches from her heart. "You're incredible," Ethan whispered, barely audible over the quiet, suckling sounds. "Absolutely incredible." She let her head sink down onto the blanket, her eyes heavy but still open enough to watch him. Her breath slowed, not perfectly, not comfortably, but with a sense of relief that washed over the room. The cubs wriggled closer, their tiny noises filling the cabin with a new kind of life, a warmth that defied the storm. But as Ethan looked at her, he knew the night had taken its toll. Her body trembled with exhaustion. The wound on her leg seeped fresh fluid, the bandage damp again. She had given everything she had left to bring these cubs into the world, and now her strength hung by a thread. "You rest," he whispered. "I'll watch over you now." Outside, the storm continued its violent chorus. But something had changed inside the cabin. The fear was still there, lurking in the shadows, but it was softened by something more powerful, hope, fragile, new and warm, but unmistakable. A mother had survived. 2 new lives had entered the world. And Ethan Carter, ranger, soldier, loner, sat watch over them like a guardian. The storm would return. The male lion would return. Danger was far from gone. But for this moment, in this small wooden cabin lost in the canyon, life had carved out a place of its own. And Ethan felt something inside himself shift, as if this night, this miracle, had quietly changed the course of everything that would come next. The storm softened as dawn crept toward the horizon, its rage thinning into a steady rain that tapped gently on the roof. No longer a threat, but a reminder of the night that had nearly broken everything. The cabin, still dim in the early light, now held a warmth that had nothing to do with the old stove in the corner. Life, tiny, trembling, and new, filled the room in quiet breaths and soft nuzzles. Ethan didn't move for a long time. He watched the lioness curled protectively around her 2 cubs, her body forming a trembling shield of fur and muscle around them. She was exhausted, more exhausted than he had ever seen even in the worst field hospitals. But she didn't rest completely. Every few seconds, she lifted her head to check on them, her gaze lingering with a tenderness that made Ethan swallow hard. There was nothing wild about the way she looked at them, nothing predatory, nothing dangerous. It was a gentle kind of love, raw, instinctive, and deeper than anything he had words for. The kind of love that stripped the world down to its essentials. She had nothing left, and she still found strength to nuzzle them, to clean their tiny faces, to keep them close against the cold air in the cabin. Ethan had seen love like that once before, years ago in a hospital room where a mother held her newborn despite shaking with her own fever. He remembered the way she'd held the baby against her chest, whispering to him, shielding him with her own body. That memory came back now, unbidden, stronger than the storm outside. He pressed a palm to his forehead, not sure why it cracked something open inside him. He wasn't expecting to feel this way tonight. Awe, grief, peace, all tangled together. The lioness shifted slightly and let out a soft, low rumble, so gentle it didn't even sound like a lion. One cub squirmed closer to her, pawing clumsily at her belly. She lowered her head and nudged it tenderly into place. The other cub nestled in beside its sibling, letting out a tiny mewl that filled the cabin with a fragile sweetness. Ethan felt his chest tighten. "You're something else," he whispered, barely audible, afraid to break the spell. "I've never seen anything like this." Her ears twitched in his direction, though she didn't lift her gaze. She trusted him enough not to treat him as a threat anymore, not in this moment. She guarded her cubs fiercely, but her fear of him had softened, folding beneath something older than instinct. Another rumble rolled across the canyon, distant but unmistakable. A reminder that the danger hadn't disappeared with the storm. Ethan's eyes flicked toward the windows, scanning the wavering shadows cast by the early dawn. The male lion might return, or another predator. The storm might have passed, but the wilderness had its own storms. He stood slowly, careful not to startle the new mother. His legs were stiff from hours kneeling on the floor. He stretched them quietly, then walked to the window to peer out at the canyon. The rain had eased into a fine mist that ghosted over the pine trees. Fog drifted low along the ground, curling through the gaps in the rocks like breath. It was peaceful now, but the illusion felt thin. He looked over at the lioness again. She had settled into a protective curl around her cubs, her breathing still uneven but calmer than before. She blinked slowly, heavily, her exhaustion returning now that the birth was over. Ethan knelt beside her once more, keeping a respectful distance. He could see how deeply she was trembling. "You need rest," he murmured. "But I know you won't sleep unless you feel safe." She lifted her head weakly, her eyes meeting his. There was something almost pleading in that gaze, something unspoken that tightened the air between them. She didn't want to close her eyes, not with danger nearby, not after everything she'd fought through, but she couldn't stay awake forever. Ethan reached toward the stove, quietly adjusting the flame to warm the room a little more. The fire's glow spread across the walls, chasing away the last traces of the storm's chill. He set a bowl of fresh water near her, though she didn't move to take it. The cubs wriggled closer to her warmth. "You've done your part," he whispered. "Let me do mine." She watched him for a long moment, her eyes searching his, as if weighing whether she could surrender to rest in the presence of a human. Then, slowly, her head lowered onto the blanket. Her breathing deepened, though every few seconds she glanced toward the door or windows. He understood. She was a mother now, not just a lioness. Her instincts were sharper than knives. So he sat down on the floor beside her, not close enough to intrude, but close enough that she could sense him. Close enough that she would know she wasn't alone. The fire crackled softly, warming the room with a comforting glow. Outside, the rain thinned even more, the mist curling into shapes that drifted away like ghosts. Minutes passed. The cubs nursed quietly. The lioness blinked slower, until finally her eyes closed fully. She didn't sink into sleep all at once. It was a battle even now, but eventually, she trusted her body to rest. Ethan leaned back against the wall, his eyes on the mother and her cubs. Something swelled inside him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He had spent most of his adult life protecting people, watching over soldiers, rescuing hikers, patching wounds. But this felt different. This felt like he'd been chosen for something rare, something that crossed the boundary between man and nature. The lioness slept at last, her breathing slow and steady. Her cubs shifted, tiny noses nudging into her belly. Ethan smiled quietly. "You did good," he whispered. "All three of you." But his smile faded as he glanced toward the window once more. The canyon was waking up, and with the dawn came new risks, new shadows, and the lingering threat that the night had only delayed. For now, though, inside this fragile bubble of warmth and stillness, there was peace. A kind of peace Ethan hadn't tasted in years. The wildest kind of love had been born in this cabin. And it had changed him quietly, deeply, in a way he didn't yet understand. But he knew one thing. He would protect this mother and her newborns with everything he had, because she had trusted him, and that trust meant everything. The storm had finally broken by the time the first pale light crept over the canyon. Morning didn't arrive quickly in Red Canyon. It slid in gently, like a slow breath across the ridges, pushing back the night in soft gray waves. The cabin glowed faintly in that half-light, warm and quiet, filled with the softest sounds. The fire's slow crackle, the mother lion's steady breaths, the tiny rustling of her newborn cubs tucked safely against her belly. Ethan had not slept for a second. He didn't feel tired. He felt anchored, as if the world outside the cabin existed on a different timeline altogether. His attention never left the lioness. Every time she shifted, he leaned forward. Every time one of the cubs squeaked, his heart clenched. He had lived through danger before, through storms, through injuries, through nights where survival balanced on a knife's edge. But none of those had felt like this. None had felt this intimate, this fragile. As dawn brightened, the lioness stirred. She lifted her head slowly, blinking against the soft light filtering in through the window. For a moment she looked disoriented, as though she had forgotten where she was. Then her gaze drifted to her cubs, and her entire body softened. She bent down, nudging them gently, licking the tops of their heads with slow, deliberate strokes that radiated nothing but love. "You made it through the night," Ethan whispered. "All three of you." The lioness looked at him. It was only a brief glance, but it was enough to stir something inside him. An acknowledgement. A reminder of the bond forged in fear and pain. She blinked slowly, then lowered her head again, drawing her cubs closer as if preparing them for something. Ethan knew the moment was coming, even before she shifted her weight onto her forelegs. He had seen this instinct before, in deer, coyotes, even wounded birds. The need to return to the wild, to the place where they belonged, pulled at them like gravity. And for a lioness, that pull was 10 times stronger. The cabin had been a sanctuary for the night, but it was not her home. "You're getting ready to go," he said softly, almost to himself. Her ears twitched. She lifted her head again, her golden eyes scanning the room, the door, the windows. The storm's remnants painted everything outside in washed-out colors, but the world looked calmer now, safer. She could smell it. The rain had scrubbed the air clean. The male lion's scent was faint, still there but pushed farther out by the weather. The danger wasn't gone, but it had moved, drifted, weakened. Slowly, carefully, she gathered her legs beneath her. The movement was shaky, painful. Her body trembled under the strain, and Ethan instinctively moved forward to steady her, but stopped himself. This was something she had to do on her own. He knelt there, hands curled into fists, watching her fight to stand. "You can do it," he murmured. "Take your time. You're stronger than you look." She rose, first onto her good foreleg, then the injured one, wincing visibly as weight settled on it. The bandage held, thank God. Her hind legs followed, lifting her into a standing position that looked unsteady but resolute. She towered over her cubs, her breath coming in slow, deliberate pulls as she adjusted her balance. The cubs squeaked in confusion, stumbling around her paws. They had no idea what the world outside held. They only knew warmth, milk, the soft safety of their mother's body. But the lioness nudged them gently, guiding them with the soft push of her muzzle toward the door. Ethan swallowed. This was it. He stood slowly, stepping back to give her space. She watched him, measuring him one last time, his posture, his breath, his intentions. He felt the weight of that gaze press against him, heavier than any storm. "I'll open it for you," he said quietly. He walked to the door. His hand hovered above the latch for a moment as a lump formed in his throat. He didn't want to let her go, not like this. Not so soon. Not after everything they had survived together. But he couldn't keep her here. The wild wasn't a place she chose. It was who she was. He unlocked the door and pushed it open. Cold morning air swept into the cabin, carrying the scent of wet earth, pine needles, and something distant and untamed. The lioness looked toward the threshold. Her body trembled, not from fear, but from the overwhelming task ahead. The world outside was waiting for her, and she answered. She took a slow step forward, her paw landing softly on the wooden floor. Her cubs stumbled beside her, confused but willing. She guided them with small nudges and soft rumbles. Her movements slow and deliberate as she crossed the boundary between human shelter and wilderness. When she reached the doorframe, she paused. She turned. Her eyes found Ethan one more time. The moment stretched between them, quiet, raw, impossible to describe. It wasn't just gratitude. It wasn't just recognition. It was something deeper, born from a night that had tested them both, a night where survival had required trust that should never have existed between their species. She blinked, slowly, intentionally. It was a goodbye. But it was more than that. It was a promise. A memory sealed. Then she stepped out into the morning light, her cubs toddling close to her sides. The mist curled around her legs as she descended the porch, her paws silent on the wet ground. She moved with a regal grace that seemed almost unreal considering the pain she carried. At the edge of the clearing, she paused again and looked back one last time. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He lifted his hand, not to wave, not to call her, but simply to acknowledge her presence one more time. "Be safe out there," he whispered. "Raise them well." The lioness turned away, disappearing into the trees with her newborns, swallowed by the quiet breath of the canyon. Ethan stood in the doorway long after she vanished, the morning chill settling over him. The cabin felt emptier now, filled with echoes of a night that already seemed like a dream. But the warmth she left behind, the trust, the miracle, the impossible bond, lingered like a quiet flame inside him. A new day had begun, and nothing in his life would ever be quite the same again. For the next few weeks, Red Canyon settled back into its familiar rhythm, the quiet that came after storms, the way the air carried the scent of pine and dust, the steady call of ravens circling over the ridges. But for Ethan, nothing felt routine anymore. Not his morning patrols, not the check-ins with nearby campsites, not even the long hours spent cataloging wildlife reports. Every shadow near the tree line caught his attention. Every distant roar made him pause. He found himself scanning for her. Sometimes he imagined he saw movement out in the brush, her silhouette slipping between the junipers, the faint shape of a cub tumbling at her heels. Sometimes he swore he heard her low, familiar rumble carried by the wind. It always faded before he could be sure. But even without seeing her, he felt her presence lingering in the canyon like an echo. And in quiet moments, sitting at his cabin table, sharpening tools or making notes on patrol routes, he would remember the way she had looked at him. That long, deep glance before stepping back into the wild. It had stayed with him, a memory that lived behind his ribs like a warm ember. Life moved on, but something inside him remained tied to that night. One late afternoon, after completing a supply run from the base station, Ethan picked up Mia Thompson, the young intern recently assigned to observe fieldwork in the canyon. She was in her early 20s, bright-eyed, eager, and still new enough to the wilderness to be amazed by everything. He admired her enthusiasm. It reminded him of himself years ago. "Beautiful evening," Mia said as she climbed into the passenger seat of his truck. "You can smell the rain coming again." Ethan nodded, scanning the horizon. Clouds were gathering low and heavy, dragging long shadows behind them. "We'll make the ridge trail loop before it hits. Shouldn't take more than an hour." They drove in comfortable silence toward the trailhead. Mia occasionally asked questions about animal tracks or migration routes, and Ethan answered with the kind of calm certainty that came from years of living in landscapes most people feared. But even as he spoke, part of his mind drifted to the lioness and her cubs. Whether they were safe, whether the male had returned, whether she still remembered him the way he remembered her. They parked near a narrow ridge path, a rocky route that wound along the canyon's upper cliffs. The trail was steep but stable, the kind of path Ethan could navigate even in pitch darkness. They walked side by side, the wind brushing against their jackets, the sky overhead dimming to a muted orange as the sun dipped low. "You ever get tired of this place?" Mia asked, stepping over a fallen branch. Ethan smiled faintly. Not once. He glanced down into the canyon as they walked. The view stretched wide, deep ravines, scattered pines, the curve of the land shaped by centuries of wind and rain. And somewhere out there, he thought, a mother lion was teaching her cubs how to fight, how to hide, how to survive. He hoped she was winning that fight. They reached a narrow stretch of the ridge, one Ethan had crossed hundreds of times. The ground was dry, the rocks stable. But storms changed things, even subtle ones. They eroded the soil beneath the top layer, hollowing it out like a brittle shell. Ethan stepped forward. The earth gave way beneath his boot. It happened fast, too fast for thought. 1 second he was walking. The next, the ground lurched downward in a tidal rush of dirt and fractured stone. Ethan's body pitched forward, air tearing from his lungs as the world tilted violently. Mia shouted his name, reaching out, but the edge crumbled beneath her fingers. Ethan fell. The sound of sliding rock roared in his ears, drowning out everything else. He tumbled down the incline, slammed against jagged outcroppings, his hands scraping uselessly for purchase. His shoulder hit stone. His knee twisted. His breath vanished. The world became a blur of sharp pain and swirling dust. Then, with a bone-rattling thud, he struck the bottom of a narrow ravine. The impact stole every sound from him. He lay there, stunned, the world spinning above him. For a moment he didn't know if he was breathing. Then pain surged, sharp, blinding pain radiating from his ankle, his ribs, his back. Mia's distant voice echoed overhead. "Ethan! Ethan! Can you hear me?" He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The air felt thick, too heavy to pull in. He tasted dust. His vision wavered as he tried to move, but the moment he attempted to shift his leg, a shockwave of agony shot through him. His ankle was ruined. He knew it instantly, broken in more than one place. "Mia!" he managed to rasp. "I'm calling it in," she shouted, panic clear in her voice. "Hold on!" She scrambled away, her footsteps pounding across the ridge toward the truck, the only place with a chance of signal. Ethan lay alone, staring at the slice of darkening sky above the canyon walls. The pain came in waves, pulsing with every heartbeat. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe through it. In, out, slow, deep. He had been hurt worse before, but never this far from help, never pinned beneath a broken body, with night coming and predators waking. The canyon changed after sunset. He knew that better than anyone. Coyotes roamed, mountain lions hunted, even wounded deer could be unpredictable in the dark. And the male lion, he could be anywhere. Ethan tried to sit up, but white-hot pain flashed across his ribs, and he collapsed back against the rock. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He felt the cold creeping in as the warmth of the day faded. He didn't know how long Mia would be gone, but it already felt too long. He listened to the canyon, wind, the rustle of brush, the groan of settling stone, and then, faintly, a rumble. not thunder. A sound he knew. His pulse spiked. He lifted his head, straining to hear past the pounding in his skull. Another rumble followed, closer this time, rolling between the canyon walls like a warning. "No," he whispered, breath trembling. He was injured, helpless, alone, a perfect target. He pushed his palms into the dirt, trying to drag himself backward, but his broken leg screamed in protest. He gasped, collapsing again, dust rising around him. The rumble grew louder, closer. He stared up at the ridge. A shadow moved along the edge, massive, graceful, familiar. His breath caught. The lioness, and behind her, two smaller shapes, clumsy but strong, following at her heels. She had found him, again. Ethan's heart pounded wildly, not with fear, but with something deeper, something raw, something like disbelief tangled with hope. "You," he whispered, breath shaking. "You came back." The lioness stood at the edge of the ridge, her silhouette outlined by the fading light. She looked down at him, her golden eyes solemn, watchful, steady. Not wild, not afraid, not cruel. Something else entirely. And for the second time in his life, Ethan Carter understood. This wasn't coincidence. This was something else. Something that would change everything. The wind drifted through the canyon in long, uneven breaths, carrying with it the scent of rain-soaked earth and pine needles. Ethan lay broken at the bottom of the ravine, his vision swimming with pain, his breath coming in shallow, uneven pulls. Every throb of his shattered ankle radiated upward like a wave of fire. His ribs, he knew at least two were cracked, made each inhale feel like a blade sliding between bone and muscle. But none of that compared to what he saw above him. The lioness stood poised on the ridge, framed by the fading amber of dusk. Her silhouette was unmistakable. Strong, regal, alive in a way no creature had the right to be after the night she had survived weeks before. And beside her, half hidden behind her hind legs, two young cubs peeked down into the canyon, their eyes wide with curiosity. She was the last creature he expected to see in the moment, between hope and losing consciousness. Yet here she was, watching him with the same steady intensity she'd shown in his cabin. But there was something different now, something older, deeper. It wasn't fear. It wasn't panic. It wasn't hunger. It was recognition, and an understanding he could not explain. "You remember me?" Ethan whispered, though it came out as more of a rasp than a voice. The lioness stepped forward, her massive paws carrying her closer to the edge. Dust spilled down from the ridge, drifting through the air like pale smoke. Her cubs followed her carefully, nudging against her legs as though unsure whether they should stay hidden or stand beside her. Her ears flicked toward the canyon floor. Her breath was slow and steady. She knew he was hurt, not in the way a predator senses weakness. This was different, intentional. A pause filled with thought rather than instinct. Ethan's vision flickered again. Pain tugged him under, pulling him toward the dark edges of consciousness. He fought it, blinking hard, because he needed to see her, needed to understand what she was doing here, now, just when he needed help the most. He could feel his heartbeat slowing, his body fading. He tried to call her name, though she didn't have one, but his voice cracked in his throat. "Please, don't go." The lioness did not go. She lifted her head toward the sky, her golden eyes narrowing with purpose. Then she let out a sound Ethan had never heard from her before. Not a roar, not a warning, not a call to her cubs. It was a deliberate, rhythmic bellow, long, deep, patterned. It echoed through the canyon like a beacon. The cubs flinched at the sound, but stayed close to her side, their small bodies trembling. She repeated the call again, more forcefully this time. The sound carried, rolling over the rocks and cliffs like a signal sent across miles. She was calling. But not for him, not for danger. She was calling for help. Ethan's breath trembled. He knew animal calls, territorial warnings, mating calls, distress signals, but this wasn't any of those. She was projecting her voice outward, toward the ranger station miles away, toward Mia, toward anyone who might be within range. "She's trying," Ethan murmured, tears stinging his eyes despite himself. "My God. She's trying to get them to come." The canyon answered back with silence. Just the wind, the whisper of shifting sand, the quiet shuffle of the young cub's paws on stone. The lioness called out again and again. Each sound gained strength, urgency, a direction only she understood. Ethan felt his chest tighten with a mix of pain and awe. The world around him blurred, but her shape remained sharp, solid, unwavering, a golden shadow that refused to leave him. He tried to lift himself, but the pain in his ankle shot up through his leg like lightning, forcing a cry from his throat. He collapsed back onto the rock, his hands shaking. The cubs stirred at the sound. One stepped forward, peering down with a curious, innocent gaze that made Ethan's heart ache. They were bigger now, stronger, their coats sleek and bright even in the fading light. The lioness lowered her head toward them, nudging them back, instructing them without words to stay behind her. Then she turned her gaze back toward Ethan, watching, assessing, protecting. A low rumble escaped her chest. Not a growl, something softer, almost reassuring. His vision blurred again. The world dimmed. The edges of reality began to fold inward. He coughed, unable to breathe deeply enough to steady himself. His skin felt cold despite the lingering heat of the day. He wasn't sure how long he could hold on, but she kept calling. Minutes later, something changed in the air. Distant footsteps echoing through the canyon, faint but growing. Ethan couldn't tell if it was real or the last clues of consciousness slipping away. But the lioness stopped calling. Her ears perked, her body tensed. She heard them first. Relief washed through Ethan's bloodstream like warm water. His chest loosened, even as his body continued to fail him. He blinked hard, forcing the world back into focus. The lioness stepped back from the ridge, her cubs pressing against her sides. She watched the direction of the approaching sounds, her body stiff and ready, not ready to attack, but ready to leave when she knew he was safe. Ethan let his head rest against the stone, tears filling his eyes again, not from pain this time, but from something far heavier. "She came back," he whispered. "She really came back." The lioness looked down at him one final time from the ridge, her eyes deep and certain. Then, as the footsteps grew closer, shouts now joining them, human voices calling his name, she nudged her cubs and stepped back from the edge, preparing to fade into the wild where she belonged. But she waited. She didn't disappear until she was certain he would not die alone, and that someone was coming for him. When the rescue team's distant flashlight beams finally broke through the canyon darkness, Ethan's last conscious sight was her golden form retreating into the trees, her cubs stumbling close behind her. She had saved him. A debt returned, a bond sealed in the wild, and then the world finally went dark. When consciousness returned, it came in scattered pieces, sounds without shapes, voices without faces, pain without direction. Ethan felt himself drifting upward through layers of thick fog, his mind struggling to return to a place where things made sense. A faint beeping reached him first, steady and mechanical. Then the subdued murmur of low voices, the cool scent of antiseptic air. A soft weight across his chest. A blanket. A hospital. He blinked slowly, his vision swimming before the room settled into focus. White walls, dim overhead light, a curtain partially drawn, his ankles suspended, wrapped in layers of support and bandaging, his ribs tightly bound, his throat dry as sand. Someone moved beside him. "Ethan? Hey, Ethan, you're awake." Mia. She stepped into view, her face pale with worry, but brightening at the sight of his eyes open. "You scared the life out of us," she whispered, brushing her palms together as though trying to hide how much her hands shook. "We thought we were too late." He tried to speak, but his voice broke into a hoarse rasp. "How long?" "You've been out since last night. Rescue found you just in time. Your vitals were dropping fast." She reached for a cup of water and held it so he could sip through a straw. "You're lucky to be alive." He exhaled slowly, the pain settling deeper into his bones as awareness sharpened. His ribs burned. His ankle throbbed. But he was alive. He shifted, wincing, then looked at Mia. "You got help," he rasped. You got to the truck." Mia hesitated. Just a beat too long. "Mia," Ethan said, voice low. "What happened?" She sank into the chair beside his bed and clasped her hands. "I tried," she said softly. "I ran as fast as I could. The trail was unstable. I had to double back once. I thought I'd never reach the truck in time. And when I finally did, something strange happened." He frowned. "Strange?" She nodded slowly, as though trying to piece the moment together again. "I turned the ignition on, trying to get a signal out. Nothing worked. No radio, no phone reception. I was about to try driving to higher ground, and then—" She paused. "I heard it." Ethan's breath hitched. "Heard what?" "A call," Mia whispered. "A lion's call. But not like a threat. Not like a challenge. It was like patterned. Repeated. Almost like it was trying to get someone's attention." Ethan's chest tightened. His pulse flickered. Mia continued, eyes wide. "It echoed across the canyon, over and over. I don't know why, but something about it pushed me to keep trying the radio. I moved a few feet. Tried again." She lifted her gaze to him. And suddenly, the signal went through. Ethan stared at her, heart pounding. "The lioness," he whispered, barely able to say the words. "She was calling." Mia's brows knit together. "It came from somewhere near the ridge. The team followed the direction of the call. That's how they found you so fast." He closed his eyes. His throat thickened with emotion he couldn't contain. She hadn't left. She hadn't abandoned him. She had stayed long enough to make sure help reached him, just as he had stayed beside her in the cabin, just as he had protected her cubs, just as she had trusted him. Mia reached out and touched his arm gently. "Ethan, was there something out there with you before we arrived?" He opened his eyes again. Pain flickered through him, not from injury this time, but from the memory of her golden silhouette fading into the trees. "Yes," he said quietly. "There was." "What was it?" "A mother." His voice cracked. A mother who remembered. Before Mia could ask more, the doctor entered the room, offering a practiced smile. He checked Ethan's pulse, his chart, his bandages. The explanation was simple. Severe fall trauma, multiple fractures, dehydration, and concussion. He needed rest, observation, physical therapy, the usual protocols. But none of it mattered, not compared to what had saved him. When the doctor left, Ethan turned his head toward the window. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, coloring the walls with soft gold. He imagined her out there, somewhere in the canyon, 2 cubs trailing behind her, the wind carrying her scent across the ridges. Mia settled beside him again. "Whatever happened out there," she said softly, "you're here because something, or someone, wouldn't let you go." He nodded, but he didn't speak. Words felt too small for what he'd lived. Night fell again before he drifted back to sleep. The hospital grew quiet. hallway lights dimming, nurses' footsteps soft and distant. Ethan's breath steadied as he settled beneath the blanket, the hum of medical equipment white noise beneath his thoughts. And then, a sound. Soft at first, distant. Not inside. Outside. He turned his head toward the window, heart rising in his throat. The blinds trembled slightly from a wind draft, and as he listened harder, he heard it again. A low, rolling call. Not loud, not threatening. A familiar cadence. A voice from the wild. His vision blurred, not from injury, but from the flood of emotion that hit him all at once. He knew that call. He had felt it in his bones before. A promise kept. A bond remembered. Somewhere outside that hospital, carried on the fading breath of night, the lioness was calling. Not for help this time, not for urgency, but as a farewell. A final acknowledgement that their lives had crossed in a way neither would ever forget. Ethan let a tear slip down his cheek. "You're safe too," he whispered into the darkness. "Go home." And as the call faded into the distance, he knew. She already had. Ethan's recovery took time. More time than he ever would have admitted to anyone outside the hospital walls. The broken ankle was reset and braced, the fractured ribs taped firmly, and the concussion monitored with soft lights and whispered questions. But it wasn't the physical pain that lingered the longest. It was the memory of the canyon, the fall, the call, and the lioness standing watch above him, like a guardian sent from some old, forgotten story carved into the bones of the wilderness. He was discharged with caution, warnings, and a thick packet of instructions, but Ethan didn't need reminders. He had lived long enough in the wild to know what healing required: time, patience, and a quiet understanding of one's limits. Still, as Mia drove him back to the ranger station, he felt something gnawing beneath his ribs. A pull. A need to return to the place where everything had changed. The sun sat low when they reached the station, painting the world in warm gold and rusty red. Ethan stepped out of the vehicle slowly, leaning on the crutch that dug gently into his side. He breathed in deeply, the scent of sagebrush, dust, and the distant murmur of the canyon winds. He hadn't realized how much he missed it until now. "You sure you're okay?" Mia asked softly, shutting the truck door behind him. He nodded. "I'm home." She didn't argue. She simply placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezed once, and said, "If you need anything, call." Then she drove away, leaving Ethan alone with the rolling quiet of Red Canyon. For a long while he just stood there, watching the horizon, feeling the ground beneath him. His cabin stood silent in the distance, the same place where life had begun on a storm-soaked night, where two tiny cubs had taken their first breaths. He saw it now in his mind. The mother curled around her little ones, the soft glow of firelight on her golden coat, the way she had watched him as if she knew what trust meant. He made his way into the cabin and paused at the threshold. It looked untouched, exactly as he had left it. The blanket still lay folded near the stove. A faint indentation remained on the wooden floorboards where she had once collapsed in exhaustion. He knelt slowly, carefully, and placed his fingers on the spot. A memory lived there. A warmth. A promise. He closed his eyes, letting the silence wash over him. His heartbeat steadied. His breath slowed. And in the quiet of that small cabin, he whispered, "Thank you." As evening approached, he found himself unable to stay still. Something deep inside him urged him toward the canyon, toward the place where the ridge overlooked the ravine. He grabbed his crutch and stepped out into the fading light, following the familiar path with slow, deliberate steps. The sky shifted into soft hues of orange and violet, the kind of sunset that made the world feel ancient and timeless. Ethan reached the ridge with effort, his breath sharp from the climb, but he pushed on until he stood at the very edge, the place where the earth had crumbled beneath him. The rocks were still disturbed, scattered from the fall. The memory of the pain flickered, but it didn't stop him. He stared down into the ravine where he had nearly died. The world below glowed with twilight shadows, every jagged stone softened by distance. It was strange standing above the place where he'd lain broken, helpless, alone. Except he hadn't been alone. A faint breeze rose from the canyon floor, brushing against his face like a whisper. He closed his eyes, and that was when he heard it. Not a roar, not a warning. A rustle, a stirring, a presence. He opened his eyes and looked to his left. At first he thought it was a trick of the fading light, a shifting shadow among the rocks. But then the shape stepped forward, slow, deliberate, unmistakable. The lioness. Her body was leaner now, her coat sleek and shining beneath the dying sun. Her leg, once torn and bound, carried her weight with a fluid grace that told him she had healed. And behind her, partly hidden in the tall grass, two half-grown cubs watched him with curious, unblinking eyes. Ethan's breath hitched, his throat tightened. She had come, not by accident, not by wandering. She had come to this very place, again. The lioness stood on a rock outcrop 100 feet away, the warm glow of the sunset outlining her silhouette in gold. Her cubs nudged at her side, their ears flicking as they studied the man who had once saved their lives without ever expecting anything in return. Ethan didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, leaning on his crutch, feeling the weight of the moment settle around him like a second skin. The lioness held his gaze. In her eyes he saw no fear, no hesitation, only recognition. Only something ancient and silent and powerful enough to stop his heart for a beat. A connection. A thank you. A goodbye. She blinked slowly, once with intention. It was the same gesture she had given him the morning she left his cabin. But now it meant something more. It was closure. It was freedom. It was acknowledgement that their paths had crossed exactly the way they needed to. Ethan felt moisture sting his eyes. He exhaled shakily, placing a hand against his chest. "Take care of them," he whispered. The lioness lowered her head, not bowing, not submitting, but answering him in her own ancient language. Then she nudged her cubs gently, guiding them toward the brush. They hesitated, glancing back at the human who had become part of their earliest memories. Then they followed her. Ethan watched as the lioness stepped into the tall grass, her tail flicking once before she melted into the wilderness. The cubs disappeared behind her, their small forms swallowed by the canyon's quiet breath. Within seconds, they were gone. A silence settled over the ridge, warm, deep, comforting. Ethan stood alone, but he didn't feel alone. The canyon seemed to pulse with life around him, the wind whispering through the pines, carrying a sense of peace he had never known. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, steadying himself before turning toward home. Behind him, the last light of sunset faded into the canyon where a mother lion and her young ones walked deeper into their world. Wild, free, alive. And Ethan Carter, ranger, soldier, survivor, felt his heart settle with a quiet truth. Some stories don't end. They become part of the land, part of the memory, part of who we are. And this one, he knew, would stay with him for the rest of his life. If this story touched your heart even a little, drop a simple 1 in the comments. Just one number, so I know you're here, feeling this moment with me. And if you'd like more real, emotional journeys from the wild, hit subscribe, tap the bell, and come back for the next story. There's so much more ahead, and I'd be honored to have you with me for every chapter.